Radio Amor.
El reciente alto el fuego llegó demasiado tarde para salvar estas aldeas.
Hoy el presidente Clinton manifestó su preocupación ante el deterioro de la situación.
Última hora. El capo internacional.
The first cruelty in 9 to 5 is not spectacular enough to look like cruelty. It arrives disguised as routine. A woman enters an office on her first day of work and discovers that the machinery of employment has already begun to reduce her into nervous gestures, misplaced papers, ringing telephones, unfamiliar procedures, and the sensation that everyone else understands a language she has somehow failed to learn. Judy Burnley, newly divorced and newly forced into the paid workforce, is not walking into a glamorous arena of ambition, but into consolidated companies. A place of fluorescent light, typewriters, desks, files, coffee, gossip, and hierarchies so thoroughly normalized that nobody needs to explain them. Her terror is comic, because the film allows us to recognize the absurdity of ordinary office life. But beneath that comedy lies something far sharper. Judy has entered an institution in which people are constantly being evaluated, ranked, interrupted, patronized, desired, exploited, or ignored. And the rules have been designed by people who do not have to suffer their consequences. Waiting for her inside this world are two women who already understand those rules too well. Violet Newstead is capable, experienced, intelligent, and so indispensable that the company casually exploits the very competence that ought to earn her power. Dora Lee Rhodes is warm, efficient, and socially isolated because their boss, Franklin Hart Jr., has encouraged the office to believe that he is sleeping with her. Judy initially sees only fragments of their predicament. Violet looks hardened because she has learned to survive disappointment. Dora Lee looks confident because she has learned to survive humiliation. Judy looks fragile because she has not yet learned the protective performance the workplace demands. What brings them together is not some abstract declaration of solidarity, but the slow discovery that their individual frustrations are variations of the same structure. Each has been told in a different vocabulary that her labor matters less than the ego of the man who controls it. Then the fantasy begins to leak into reality. The women imagine killing Hart, and their fantasies are outrageously theatrical. Revenge becomes a western, a fairy tale, a hunting spectacle, a comic dream in which humiliation can finally be answered with perfect symbolic justice. Yet the film's central joke is that imagination is safer than reality, only until reality starts behaving like farce. A poisoned cup of coffee, a hospital misunderstanding, a stolen corpse, panic, suspicion, and finally the kidnapping of Hart turn private resentment into an escalating conspiracy. The women who could barely challenge their boss in the office suddenly find themselves holding him captive in his own home. The fantasy of removing the tyrant becomes something more interesting than murder. They discover that the truly radical possibility is not getting rid of a man, but discovering how much better the institution can function when his authority is removed. That is the durable brilliance of 9 to 5. The film invites its audience with the promise of revenge, but it ultimately becomes a comedy about administration, labor, and imagination. Its most satisfying act of rebellion is not violence. It is competence freed from obstruction. Hart's absence allows Violet, Doralee, and Judy to reorganize the office, introduce flexible hours, create a job-sharing program, establish a childcare center, improve the physical workspace, and treat employees as people whose domestic lives, dignity, and intelligence actually matter. The film's joke gradually becomes its political thesis. The workplace does not require cruelty in order to be productive. Cruelty is merely one of the privileges that hierarchy has taught itself to mistake for management. Released in 1980, 9 to 5 arrived at a cultural moment when the contradictions embodied by its three protagonists were becoming increasingly difficult for American popular culture to ignore. Women had entered clerical and professional workplaces in enormous numbers, yet their numerical presence did not automatically translate into institutional power. Offices could depend on female labor while continuing to treat authority as masculine, advancement as masculine, and female ambition as something suspicious, conditional, or amusing. Secretaries and clerical workers often possessed extraordinary knowledge of how organizations actually function, while remaining excluded from the titles, salaries, and decision-making authority granted to men whose work they supported. The film takes this familiar arrangement and makes its absurdity visible by asking a simple question. What if the women who already know how everything works were allowed to run everything? The project emerged from a distinctly political environment, but one of its great achievements was its refusal to make politics feel like homework. Jane Fonda, who plays Judy and was instrumental in bringing the film into existence, had become increasingly interested in the experiences of women working in offices. The title itself evokes the labor organization 9 to 5, associated with the growing movement for the rights of women office workers. Patricia Resnick developed the story, and Colin Higgins, who directed the film and co-wrote the screenplay with Resnick, shaped that material into a populist comedy capable of carrying workplace critique into multiplex entertainment. The resulting film belongs to a particularly valuable tradition of political comedy. It does not hide its argument, but neither does it subordinate pleasure to argument. It understands that laughter can be not merely decoration, but a method of analysis. Higgins was an unusually appropriate director for this kind of tonal balancing act. His earlier screenwriting and directing work had shown an attraction to characters trapped within social expectations who discover liberation through eccentricity, reversal, or unlikely companionship. 9 to 5 requires precisely that sensibility because its subject is potentially bleak. Sexual harassment, wage inequality, workplace discrimination, managerial retaliation, and economic vulnerability are not inherently light material. The film avoids trivializing them by refusing to make the oppression itself the main source of amusement. Hart is funny because his vanity is ridiculous. The women are funny because their attempts to respond to him push ordinary social behavior into escalating absurdity. The power structure remains recognizable, even when the plot becomes delirious. This distinction matters. A lesser comedy might have treated Hart as an isolated bad apple whose removal restores an otherwise healthy institution. 9 to 5 repeatedly suggests something more systemic. Hart is certainly an exceptional narcissist, but the organization enables him. He takes credit for Violet's ideas because the company lacks mechanisms that would reliably expose the theft. He spreads sexual rumors about Doralee because male authority possesses greater credibility than female testimony. He overlooks Violet for promotion because the decision-making structure allows prejudice to masquerade as managerial judgment. He intimidates Judy because economic dependence makes disagreement dangerous. His personal ugliness thrives because the institution has converted asymmetrical power into normal procedure. Dabney Coleman's performance is crucial because Hart must remain grotesque without becoming unbelievable. Coleman plays him not as a demonic mastermind, but as a mediocre man intoxicated by institutional permission. Hart's vocabulary of self-importance is one of his weapons. He rarely experiences himself as abusive. Instead, he experiences his own desires as reasonable extensions of his position. He can harass Doralee while imagining himself charming, betray Violet while imagining himself pragmatic, and terrify subordinates while imagining himself managerial. Coleman understands that the comedy becomes sharper when Hart believes in his own legitimacy. His evil is banal in the most literal sense. He treats exploitation as ordinary business. The film introduces him through behavior rather than psychological explanation. We do not need a traumatic childhood or an ideological monologue to understand Franklin Hart Jr. His character is written into the spatial arrangements of the office. He has a private room while others occupy shared space. He can summon employees, interrupt them, observe them, and force them to wait. His office becomes a theater in which the conventions of corporate power are performed. Every entrance into that room carries an implicit reminder that the person behind the desk can influence salaries, promotions, reputations, and continued employment. The set itself participates in characterization because Hart's authority is architectural before it becomes verbal. Violet occupies the opposite relationship to the institution. She possesses knowledge without corresponding power. Lily Tomlin gives the character a combination of exhaustion, wit, precision, and contained fury that makes her perhaps the film's clearest embodiment of structural injustice. Violet understands the organization so thoroughly that she can anticipate problems before others recognize them. Her intelligence is practical rather than decorative. She knows procedures, personalities, routines, technologies, and the 1,000 invisible adjustments necessary to keep an office functioning. When a less qualified man receives the promotion she deserves, the insult hurts not merely because Violet wants status, it hurts because the decision denies an observable reality. That denial is one of the film's central subjects. Workplace sexism often operates not through explicit declarations that women are incapable, but through endless systems for refusing to acknowledge demonstrated capability. Violet does not need an inspirational speech telling her that she is talented. She already knows she is talented. The tragedy is that competence does not protect her from hierarchy. Indeed, competence can deepen exploitation because the institution becomes more dependent on her while remaining unwilling to reward her proportionately. She becomes the person who solves problems for people who are then promoted above her. Tomlin's comic timing transforms this frustration into energy rather than self-pity. Violet's sarcasm is a survival mechanism, but it is also an analytical instrument. She sees hypocrisy quickly and names it with an economy of language. Her irritation with Judy during the newcomer's chaotic first day is therefore revealing. Violet initially reproduces some of the harshness of the environment because she is under pressure herself. The film does not idealize female solidarity as automatic. Women can become impatient with one another, misread one another, envy one another, and participate in the same routines that harm them. Solidarity has to be constructed through recognition. That recognition is especially important in Doralee storyline. Dolly Parton, making her major film acting debut, brings to Doralee a brightness that could easily have been reduced to caricature. The screenplay deliberately positions the character inside a familiar stereotype. She is glamorous, voluptuous, blonde, friendly, and therefore vulnerable to being interpreted through male fantasy. Hart exploits precisely that expectation. He tells the office implicitly and explicitly that Doralee's proximity to him is sexual, and because his version of events fits an existing stereotype, the rumor becomes socially convenient. Other women distance themselves from Doralee, punishing her for Hart's behavior. The cruelty of that situation is easy to miss because Parton plays Doralee with such buoyancy, yet her isolation is one of the film's most painful details. She arrives at work surrounded by colleagues, but deprived of community. Her friendliness encounters suspicion because other employees believe she has obtained privileged access to Hart through sex. This shows how harassment can damage a target beyond the direct encounters between victim and harasser. Hart does not merely make unwanted advances, he colonizes Doralee's social identity. He tells a story about her, and his position gives that story institutional credibility. The scene in which Doralee discovers what Hart has been saying about her is therefore more than a comic confrontation. It is a reclaiming of authorship. Her anger comes from realizing that an explanation has suddenly been supplied for countless minor exclusions she has previously endured without understanding them. The coldness of colleagues, the whispers, the looks, the absence of invitations, all acquire meaning. Parton plays the revelation with a wounded fury that rapidly becomes controlled threat. Dorley's famous promise about what she might do to Hart if he continues his behavior is funny because of its vividness, but the laughter contains the pleasure of seeing someone finally seize control of the language used to diminish her. Dorley also complicates the cultural politics of the film, because Parton's own star image brought class, regional, and gender associations into the character. She was already a major figure in country music, famous for a highly stylized femininity that some observers misread as naivete. Parton's public persona had long demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of performance. Exaggeration could become a form of control. Dorley similarly understands more than others initially assume. Her appearance becomes the basis for other characters' projections, yet she repeatedly refuses the identities imposed upon her. The film's feminism is strengthened by allowing a conventionally glamorous woman to be neither a symbol of false consciousness nor an object requiring ideological correction. Judy, meanwhile, serves as both participant and audience surrogate. Jane Fonda's performance emphasizes disorientation at the beginning because Judy has experienced a drastic collapse in social identity. She has been abandoned by her husband, deprived of the domestic arrangement around which her life had been organized, and forced into employment without the confidence that comes from experience. Her first days at Consolidated are filled with technological humiliation. Machines refuse to obey her, procedures blur together, she misinterprets expectations. Fonda, an actor often associated with intensity and intelligence, willingly turns her body into a field of anxious mistakes. The comedy of Judy's incompetence is carefully structured, because the film does not imply that she lacks intelligence. She lacks training. That distinction is politically significant. Institutions often naturalize expertise, encouraging the belief that competent workers simply possess an innate aptitude that incompetent workers lack. 9 to 5 repeatedly demonstrates that office work consists of learned systems. Judy's early failure reveals how much knowledge the experienced women around her actually possess. Violet's ability to navigate the environment only looks effortless because years of labor have rendered expertise invisible. Judy's transformation across the film is consequently not a simple story of a timid woman becoming brave. She gains practical competence, social belonging, and political consciousness simultaneously. At first, she experiences workplace problems as personal embarrassments. Later, she learns to recognize them as shared conditions. That movement from private shame to collective analysis is one of the film's deepest structural patterns. Violet's blocked promotion, Dorley's harassment, and Judy's insecurity initially appear to belong to separate categories. Friendship reveals their connection. The moment when the three women leave the office environment and spend time together outside work is therefore essential. Away from desks, telephones, supervisors, and fluorescent authority, they can reinterpret the experiences that seemed immovable during office hours. Intoxication loosens the rules of respectable behavior. They complain, laugh, confess, and fantasize. The sequence is often remembered for its broad comedy, especially the elaborate fantasies of killing Hart, but its underlying function is almost therapeutic. The women create an unofficial counter-institution in which their perceptions can be validated. That validation changes everything. Oppressive environments survive partly by isolating perception. If Dorley believes other women dislike her because of something she has done, if Violet believes her stalled career reflects some personal deficiency, and if Judy believes workplace humiliation proves she is inadequate, then each woman remains psychologically separated from the others. Conversation allows them to compare evidence. Once they do, Hart's behavior becomes a pattern rather than a collection of unrelated incidents. Laughter becomes the sound of pattern recognition. The revenge fantasies that follow are among the film's most inventive devices, because each fantasy expresses the personality and symbolic needs of the woman imagining it. They are not realistic plans. They are mini-genres, extravagant spectacles of compensation, in which power is redistributed according to dream logic. Judy's fantasy transforms her into a figure capable of hunting Hart through an exaggerated masculine adventure landscape. Dorley's fantasy invokes a Western-inflected reversal in which the man who treated her body as available becomes the helpless object of someone else's control. Violet's fantasy draws upon fairy tale imagery, giving domestic and feminine-coded objects an unexpectedly lethal agency. The formal looseness of these sequences is important. The ordinary office is visually governed by repetition. Desks, grids, files, schedules, standardized clothing, recurring routines. Fantasy breaks the grid. Color, costume, movement, scale, and genre conventions become unstable. The women imagine worlds in which the structures restricting them can be replaced instantly. Yet the fantasies are deliberately excessive because they cannot serve as practical politics. They provide emotional release, not institutional reform. The film's next movement brilliantly exploits the dangerous proximity between fantasy and accident. Once Violet becomes convinced that she may have actually poisoned Hart, the imaginary murder stories suddenly contaminate ordinary reality. The women's confidence collapses. They are not hardened criminals, but workers who have entertained forbidden thoughts in a culture where even expressing anger can feel dangerous. Their panic generates some of the film's most elaborate farce, especially the hospital and corpse confusion, because they begin interpreting every event through guilt. Farce is sometimes dismissed as a mechanically inferior comic form, yet 9 to 5 demonstrates how useful farce can be for representing institutional anxiety. Characters move through systems they only partially understand, information arrives incomplete, assumptions multiply, bodies and objects are mistaken for one another, doors open at the wrong moment, authority is constantly about to discover transgression. This is remarkably close to the experience of bureaucratic power. A worker frequently does not know who knows what has been recorded, which rule applies, or how an error might escalate. The film exaggerates that uncertainty until it becomes almost metaphysical. The stolen body episode also introduces a dark comic undercurrent that distinguishes 9 to 5 from gentler workplace comedies. The women's rebellion is not initially clean or dignified. It is messy, desperate, and absurd. They make terrible decisions because they are frightened. Their attempts to conceal what they believe is a crime produce behavior far more incriminating than the original accident. The film thus grants them the right to comic incompetence without withdrawing our sympathy. This is significant because female characters in politically conscious films are often burdened with representational perfection. Violet, Doralee, and Judy are allowed to be foolish. Their foolishness also protects the film from becoming a fantasy of moral superiority. The women do not defeat Hart because they are pure human beings. They defeat him because they eventually recognize both his corruption and their own collective capability. This difference becomes central once they discover that Hart has been involved in financial misconduct. The plot reverses the logic of accusation. Hart, who has relied on institutional authority to discipline women, becomes vulnerable because his own actions cannot survive scrutiny. Kidnapping him marks the film's most radical comic reversal. Hart is removed from the environment that produces his power. At home, stripped of office, secretarial support, and the rituals of corporate hierarchy, he becomes merely a ridiculous man in captivity. The elaborate apparatus used to restrain him literalizes what the office previously concealed. Power is always a matter of constraint, but at Consolidated, the constraints were procedural and therefore invisible. Hart could control schedules, wages, assignments, and reputations without appearing physically coercive. Once he is bound and suspended, the metaphor becomes wonderfully crude. Yet his captivity is not simply revenge. It creates a vacancy, and the vacancy becomes an experiment. This is where 9 to 5 becomes much more ambitious than its high-concept premise might suggest. The obvious comic climax would have been Hart's humiliation, perhaps followed by his exposure and the women's vindication. Instead, the film asks what happens in the office while he is gone. The answer is that the women govern. Violet effectively assumes managerial authority, with Doralee and Judy as collaborators, and they begin introducing policies reflecting experiences that had previously been treated as irrelevant to corporate decision-making. These reforms are striking because they are not utopian abstractions. They concern time, care, flexibility, environment, and dignity. Employees gain greater control over working hours. Job sharing recognizes that a position does not have to be organized around one rigid model of availability. Childcare acknowledges that workers do not stop being parents when they enter an office. Changes to the physical environment acknowledge that beauty and comfort are not frivolous when people spend large portions of their lives at work. The film's politics become material. The reforms also reveal the narrowness of Hart's managerial imagination. He assumes that authority means surveillance and discipline. Violet understands that management can mean designing conditions under which people can work effectively. This contrast remains remarkably contemporary because debates about workplace flexibility continue to revolve around competing assumptions about human motivation. Hart's model presumes that workers must be controlled because they will otherwise evade responsibility. Violet's model presumes that people often perform better when institutions recognize the complexity of their lives. The film further strengthens its argument by connecting humane reform to productivity. This can be interpreted in more than one way. On the one hand, it makes the reforms legible within the logic of capitalism. The company becomes more productive, so even senior management must acknowledge their value. On the other hand, the need to justify dignity through productivity reveals a limitation. The film rarely argues that workers deserve humane conditions simply because they are human. It frequently reassures the audience that humane treatment is also good business. That compromise is characteristic of mainstream American political comedy. Radical ideas are often translated into the language of institutional efficiency so that transformation can appear practical rather than revolutionary. 9 to 5 wants spectators to enjoy the fantasy of workplace democratization without requiring them to reject the corporation itself. Consolidated companies is reformable. The villain is expelled or displaced. Policies improve, productivity rises, and the larger economic structure remains intact. This does not invalidate the film's critique. On the contrary, the compromise helps explain its extraordinary reach. A film openly furious about sexism, harassment, unequal promotion, and workplace hierarchy became a major commercial success because it encoded critique within forms audiences already loved. Buddy comedy, revenge fantasy, workplace farce, caper, and star vehicle. Its argument could travel farther because it was pleasurable. The title song performs a similar function. Dolly Parton's 9 to 5 is one of those rare pieces of popular music that seems to summarize an entire social environment within seconds. Its famous typewriter-like rhythmic texture immediately connects musical form to clerical labor. The song is buoyant, catchy, and propulsive, yet its lyrics describe exhaustion, underpayment, stolen credit, and the frustration of working inside systems controlled by others. The contrast between musical pleasure and lyrical dissatisfaction mirrors the film's own method. The song also universalizes what the film particularizes. Violet, Dorley, and Judy are specific characters, but 9 to 5 turns their problems into a collective rhythm. The workday becomes a beat. Repetition itself becomes musical structure. Workers pour themselves into routines that promise advancement while often reproducing dependency. Parton's performance carries indignation without losing warmth, making the song neither a lament nor a manifesto, but something between the two, a communal complaint that people can sing together. Its integration into the film's opening montage is especially effective because music organizes the fragmented gestures of the morning commute and office arrival into a shared system. Individual workers move through private rituals, yet editing reveals repetition across bodies. Shoes cross sidewalks, elevators open, hands carry bags and coffee, machines awaken, desks fill, time becomes measurable. The montage transforms routine into choreography. This opening is crucial to the film's visual philosophy. 9 to 5 is not primarily celebrated for flamboyant cinematography, but its apparent conventionality serves the material. The office is presented as recognizable enough that spectators can project their own workplace experiences into it. The camera frequently allows environments to remain legible, preserving desks, partitions, corridors, and clusters of workers as social spaces, rather than reducing everything to isolated close-ups. Corporate architecture becomes a map of hierarchy. The visual blandness of the office also creates a meaningful contrast with fantasy. Consolidated spaces are dominated by functional design and bureaucratic repetition. The women's imagined revenge worlds are saturated with genre references and expressive transformation. When the office itself later becomes more colorful and humane under their management, the shift carries symbolic weight. They do not merely administer the same environment more kindly, they begin altering what the environment communicates about the people inside it. This emphasis on space connects 9 to 5 with a long history of films about institutions. Cinema has always been fascinated by buildings that organize human behavior. Schools, prisons, hospitals, factories, military barracks, offices. The office is particularly interesting because it rarely looks coercive. Workers are not physically confined. They can theoretically leave. Yet economic necessity and professional hierarchy generate powerful forms of discipline. The office, therefore, depends on voluntary, looking obedience. 9 to 5 repeatedly turns that hidden discipline into visible comedy. Hart's summonses, surveillance, assignments, and punishments seem petty, yet their cumulative effect determines the atmosphere of the workplace. Employees monitor themselves because they know they can be observed. They regulate speech, clothing, punctuality, and emotional expression. Even friendship becomes vulnerable to managerial interference. The secretarial role is central to this system because secretaries occupy an unstable position between intimacy and subordination. They know schedules, correspondence, private habits, and institutional secrets. They may possess more information than many executives, yet information does not automatically become authority. Dorley's access to Hart exposes her to sexual suspicion. Violet's operational knowledge exposes her to exploitation. The office depends upon women who are close enough to power to sustain it, but not close enough to own it. This contradiction gives the film's rebellion its plausibility. The women can take over because they already know how to do much of what management requires. Hart's authority has always depended on labor that he does not fully understand. Once he disappears, his supposed indispensability is exposed as theatrical. The organization does not collapse. It improves. The fantasy of the absent boss has obvious comic appeal, but the film goes further by suggesting that bad managers do more than fail to contribute. They actively obstruct the intelligence of others. Hart consumes energy. Employees must anticipate his moods, repair his mistakes, endure his harassment, protect themselves from retaliation, and navigate his vanity. Remove him, and that wasted energy becomes available for work. The idea remains powerful because organizations often underestimate the productivity cost of domination. A workplace governed through fear may produce compliance while destroying initiative. People devote attention to avoiding punishment rather than solving problems. They conceal errors rather than report them. They compete for favor rather than cooperate. They learn the preferences of authority rather than the needs of the task. 9 to 5 turns this organizational insight into comedy long before management literature made similar arguments fashionable. Violet's leadership is effective partly because it emerges from proximity to the work itself. She has experienced the systems she changes. The reforms are not imposed by an abstract executive philosophy, but developed from accumulated irritation. What looks from above like flexibility looks from below like sanity. The film implies that institutions would make better decisions if the people most affected by policies possessed meaningful authority over them. This is where the film's feminism intersects with labor politics. Gender discrimination is not presented solely as a problem of representation at the top. It is embedded in the organization of work. Childcare matters because employment structures were designed around assumptions about who performs domestic care. Flexible schedules matter because the standardized workday imagines an ideal worker unencumbered by family obligations. Promotion matters because occupational hierarchies convert cultural prejudice into material inequality. 9 to 5 therefore belongs to a feminist tradition concerned not simply with whether women can become bosses, but with whether workplaces themselves can change. This distinction has become even more important over time. A corporation can promote women into leadership while preserving exploitative structures. Representation and transformation are related, but not identical. Violet's temporary authority matters because she uses it to alter conditions for others. At the same time, the film's solution remains centralized. Violet becomes a benevolent manager rather than creating a democratic workplace in which employees collectively govern themselves. The reforms come from enlightened leadership, not formal redistribution of ownership or authority. That limitation reflects both the film's mainstream orientation and the political imagination of its ending. The fantasy is not revolution. It is a competent administration finally listening to workers. The character of Russell Tinsworthy, the company chairman, embodies this compromise. When senior authority eventually appears, it does not automatically defend Hart. Instead, it evaluates results. The improvements impress him. The joke depends on Hart's inability to claim credit honestly without exposing his absence, while the women remain trapped by the peculiar circumstances of their rebellion. Senior management accepts progressive reform, not because it has been morally persuaded, but because performance has improved. This ending is enormously satisfying on the level of comic justice. Hart, who repeatedly stole credit from Violet, finds himself caught in a reversal where changes implemented without him are attributed to his management. Yet, even this apparent reward becomes punishment because corporate authority responds by sending him away, extending his career into a new assignment rather than delivering the public disgrace the women might have preferred. The institution absorbs the contradiction. The irony is exquisite. Hart benefits from the very reforms he resisted because organizations are often capable of misrecognizing the origins of success. The film refuses the simplistic fantasy in which truth is perfectly documented and merit perfectly allocated. Violet, Dorley, and Judy know what happened. The audience knows. Hart knows. Tinsworthy does not fully know. Institutional narratives remain imperfect, yet the practical outcome is favorable. Hart is removed, the reforms survive, and the women gain greater possibilities. The film thus chooses consequential justice over ceremonial justice. Hart does not necessarily receive the confession and punishment scene that a moral melodrama might demand. Instead, he loses control over the space where he exercised power. That is more important. The final movement also completes Judy's transformation. Early in the film, she can barely survive a workday without catastrophe. By the end, she has participated in a kidnapping, helped reorganize a corporation, confronted her former husband, and developed a sense of identity independent of the marriage, whose collapse initially seemed to define her. Her development connects economic independence with psychological independence. The scene involving Judy's husband is especially important because it reveals how the workplace story and the domestic story mirror each other. At the beginning, Judy enters employment because a man's decision has destabilized her life. Her marriage had organized her economic identity around dependence. When her husband attempts to return, he implicitly assumes that Judy remains the person he left. She does not. Her refusal is not framed merely as romantic rejection. It is evidence that new forms of competence have altered her perception of herself. Employment has been humiliating, but it has also produced relationships and capabilities that were unavailable within the old domestic arrangement. The film does not romanticize wage labor as pure liberation. The office itself is oppressive. Instead, it suggests that autonomy requires both economic participation and transformation of the conditions under which that participation occurs. Jane Fonda's casting adds another layer to this trajectory. By 1980, Fonda carried a complex screen and public identity shaped by dramatic roles, political activism, controversy, glamour, and seriousness. Playing Judy allows her to parody helplessness without becoming trivial. The audience can sense intelligence behind the character's nervousness. That tension makes Judy's growth credible because we gradually watch dormant confidence acquire practical form. Fonda also functions structurally as a bridge between viewers and the film's more experienced workers. Judy needs explanations, so the world can be explained to us through her. Yet, the film does not leave her permanently naive. Once she understands the system, she becomes capable of anger. This movement from innocence to indignation gives the narrative its emotional acceleration. Anger is one of the film's most carefully managed resources. Popular entertainment has historically been more comfortable with angry men than angry women, especially when female anger targets ordinary social institutions rather than melodramatic villains. 9 to 5 makes women's anger enjoyable by translating it into wit, fantasy, and farce. The strategy is politically double-edged. Comedy makes anger culturally acceptable, but it can also soften it. The film appears conscious of this tension. Its fantasies are funny because the women's rage is enormous. Hart is shot, hunted, humiliated, restrained, and symbolically reduced. The excess of the fantasies communicates emotional truth, even when the plot retreats from literal violence. Comedy becomes a container large enough to hold fury without requiring a tragic conclusion. This is particularly visible in Violet's fantasy, where the language of fairy tale collides with workplace revenge. Fairy tales traditionally encode social hierarchies through kings, witches, servants, daughters, and transformations. By placing Hart inside the symbolic vocabulary, the film converts corporate authority into mythic tyranny. Violet's revenge becomes possible only when she temporarily enters a world where injustice is legible enough to receive magical punishment. The contrast with the real office is revealing. In fairy tales, villains usually announce themselves. In bureaucracies, villains sign forms. Hart's power is difficult to confront because it is distributed through procedures that look normal. Fantasy simplifies moral structure. Reality requires collective strategy. Doralee fantasy similarly transforms harassment into a reversal of physical vulnerability. Hart has treated her body as if his desire gave him rights over it. Her fantasy makes him physically powerless. The pleasure of the sequence lies not in cruelty for its own sake, but in the inversion of who is allowed to define the terms of bodily exposure and fear. Judy's fantasy is perhaps the most revealing of her psychological development, because it gives her access to a confidence she does not yet possess in waking life. Fantasy allows her to rehearse agency. This is a recurring function of imagination throughout the film. Before the women can change their world, they must imagine themselves capable of violating its rules. That makes 9 to 5 a film about fantasy in a broader political sense. Social systems often maintain themselves by presenting alternatives as impossible. People may dislike their conditions while being unable to imagine a credible replacement. The women's revenge fantasies are initially impossible alternatives, but they loosen the boundaries of obedience. Once Hart is actually removed, they discover that practical transformation is less impossible than they assumed. The film's comic escalation therefore contains an argument about political imagination. Change begins as an absurd thought. What if the boss were gone? What if workers decided the schedules? What if childcare were considered a business concern? What if employees could decorate their environment? What if the people doing the work designed the workplace? None of these questions is as spectacular as murder. That is precisely the point. The movie starts with fantasies of killing a tyrant and ends with policies. This transition from violent fantasy to administrative reform is one of the reasons 9 to 5 has aged better than many high-concept comedies of its period. Its most memorable jokes are attached to a structure of ideas. Even viewers who do not consciously analyze the film's politics can experience the emotional logic. Frustration becomes companionship. Companionship becomes imagination. Imagination becomes rebellion. Rebellion becomes reorganization. The three-woman ensemble is essential to this progression, because no single protagonist could represent the range of workplace experiences the film wants to address. Violet embodies blocked advancement and unrecognized expertise. Doralee embodies harassment, sexual rumor, and the social punishment of femininity. Judy embodies economic vulnerability, re-entry into paid labor, and the acquisition of workplace identity. Their differences also prevent the film from presenting women as a perfectly uniform category. They come from different backgrounds, possess different temperaments, and respond differently to danger. Violet tends toward strategic control, Doralee toward direct confrontation, Judy toward anxious improvisation. Their friendship works because these qualities become complementary. Comedy ensembles often derive energy from incompatibility, and 9 to 5 uses the contrast among Fonda, Tomlin, and Parton with remarkable precision. Tomlin's dry intelligence, Parton's radiant warmth, and Fonda's escalating nervousness create three distinct rhythmic styles. Scenes work because reactions arrive at different speeds. Violet may understand the absurdity first, Doralee may puncture tension with directness, and Judy may intensify chaos by panicking. The film gives each performer enough space to establish an independent comic identity while constantly recombining them. This is harder than it looks. Ensemble comedies frequently allow one character to dominate, reducing others to support functions. 9 to 5 depends on the audience believing that each woman is indispensable to the emotional and political structure. Tomlin provides the film's sharpest edge. Parton provides its generosity. Fonda provides its transformation. Coleman provides resistance. Their chemistry also explains why the movie can move so quickly between realism and absurdity. The performers maintain character consistency even when the plot becomes improbable. The situation may escalate into kidnapping, but Violet still thinks like Violet. Doralee remains Doralee. Judy remains Judy. Farce works when behavior becomes extreme without becoming arbitrary. Colin Higgins stages many of these sequences with an emphasis on reaction. The comedy is often less about the event itself than about who realizes its implications first. A mistaken assumption passes from one face to another. Panic becomes contagious. Someone attempts to remain calm while another person makes calmness impossible. Editing turns social information into rhythm. This is particularly effective during the hospital confusion. The women operate with incomplete knowledge and therefore construct an elaborate story around fragments. The audience's pleasure comes from occupying a slightly superior position. We can see how one false assumption generates another. Yet the women's fear makes their logic emotionally understandable. Farce requires this delicate balance. Characters must be wrong without seeming stupid. The film repeatedly uses objects as carriers of anxiety. Coffee, office equipment, files, telephones, restraints, documents, and household devices acquire narrative significance because bureaucratic life itself is object-dense. Workers constantly interact with technologies and tools that mediate authority. A message can incriminate. A file can reveal. A cup can become evidence. A machine can humiliate. The typewriter is especially important as an emblem of clerical labor. Before digital offices, typing speed and accuracy formed part of the gendered infrastructure of white-collar work. The rhythmic clicking associated with secretarial labor becomes musical in the title song and comic in Judy's struggles. The technology is both mundane and disciplinary. Workers must adapt their bodies to machines whose pace becomes part of productivity. The film appeared at a moment when the American office was beginning a technological transition that would accelerate dramatically during the following decade. Electronic systems, word processing, and personal computing would eventually transform clerical labor, but the social hierarchies represented in 9 to 5 would prove more durable than specific machines. This is one reason the movie remains legible even to viewers who have never used a typewriter in an office. Technologies change faster than power relations. Indeed, contemporary viewers may find the film simultaneously dated and startlingly current. The clothing, equipment, hairstyles, and corporate interiors announce 1980 immediately. The complaints do not. Sexual harassment by supervisors, unequal promotion, stolen credit, insufficient childcare, rigid scheduling, burnout, workplace rumor, and managerial surveillance remain recognizable. What changes across generations is often the vocabulary available to describe these experiences. 9 to 5 was produced before many contemporary discussions of workplace harassment had entered mainstream public discourse in their present form. The movie therefore performs important cultural labor simply by making patterns visible through popular entertainment. Hart's behavior toward Dora Lee is particularly significant in retrospect. He weaponizes both private advances and public insinuation. If Dora Lee rejects him, he can continue pursuing her because he controls professional conditions. If she complains, his higher status gives him credibility. Meanwhile, rumors damage her relationships with coworkers. This is not merely unwanted flirting. It is an abuse of institutional asymmetry. The film understands that harassment is fundamentally about power rather than attraction. Hart's desire matters because he possesses the authority to convert desire into pressure. His behavior is enabled by an environment in which Dora Lee's continued employment depends on navigating his ego. The fact that his advances are comic in presentation does not erase their coercive structure. Parton's performance refuses to allow Dora Lee to become defined by victimization. This is crucial. She experiences harassment, but the film gives her humor, loyalty, intelligence, anger, style, and agency beyond the abuse. She is not reduced to evidence in the prosecution of Hart. She remains a full comic protagonist. Violet's discrimination is less spectacular but equally important because it demonstrates how inequality can be reproduced through supposedly ordinary personnel decisions. The man promoted over her does not need to be dramatically incompetent. He simply needs to be less deserving than Violet. That is enough to expose the system. The emotional power of her disappointment comes from accumulated expectation. Violet has followed the rules. She has worked hard, acquired knowledge, solved problems, and waited. Meritocratic ideology promises that these behaviors will eventually be rewarded. The promotion decision reveals that the promise is conditional. This is why Hart's theft of Violet's ideas matters so much. Credit is a form of workplace currency. The person associated with an idea often receives the reputational benefit, even when others did the intellectual labor. Because Violet's role positions her as support, her contributions can be absorbed into Hart's authority without appearing to be theft. The organizational chart predetermines authorship. 9 to 5 exposes this mechanism through comedy, but the insight is profound. Power often determines not only who decides, but who appears to know. A superior can become associated with the competence of subordinates because institutional narratives flow upward. Success confirms leadership, failure descends. The women's takeover reverses that flow. For once, operational knowledge and managerial power converge. Violet can implement the changes she understands to be necessary, instead of merely suggesting them to someone who might claim the credit. The efficiency of this arrangement becomes the film's most devastating joke about Hart. He is not defeated because someone more ruthless replaces him. He is defeated by evidence that he was unnecessary. That humiliation is more conceptually satisfying than physical revenge, because Hart's identity depends on the belief that power proves worth. If the office functions better without him, then his authority can no longer be interpreted as evidence of competence. He becomes exposed as an overhead cost disguised as leadership. The broader corporate structure, however, never fully recognizes this truth. Tinsworthy believes Hart deserves some credit for improvements. The audience therefore experiences dramatic irony. We understand the organization more accurately than its highest-ranking executive. This is another subtle critique. Hierarchies can prevent leaders from knowing what actually happens below them. Information passes through layers shaped by incentives, self-protection, and reputation. Tinsworthy sees outcomes, but not process. He can praise improvements while misidentifying their origin. The women's secrecy contributes to that misunderstanding, of course, because they cannot easily reveal the kidnapping. Yet the comic premise amplifies a real organizational problem. Senior management often interprets data without understanding the informal labor that produced it. 9 to 5 is therefore surprisingly interested in epistemology, the politics of who knows what and whose knowledge counts. Violet knows how the office works, but Hart has formal authority. Dora Lee knows Hart is lying, but gossip grants authority to his version. Judy initially knows almost nothing, making her dependent on others' interpretations. Tinsworthy knows the company's performance, but not the circumstances producing it. The plot advances through redistributions of knowledge. Friendship gives the women information about one another. The discovery of Hart's misconduct gives them leverage. His captivity gives them access to decision-making. Their reforms generate new organizational knowledge by testing alternatives. Comedy becomes a way of exposing the distance between formal knowledge and practical knowledge. Hart knows how to act like a boss. Violet knows how to run the office. That distinction is embedded in performance style as well. Coleman's Hart frequently performs authority through posture, voice, and interruption. He enjoys the theatrical rituals of power. Tomlin's Violet rarely needs theatricality, because her authority, when she finally exercises it, comes from competence. Her leadership feels less like performance because she understands the work. The film does not completely reject performance, however. Dorley's femininity is highly performative, and that performance is a source of strength. Parton had long understood how exaggerated glamour could function as both entertainment and self-authorship. The film allows Dorley to inhabit conventionally feminine aesthetics without presenting them as submission. This is one of the ways 9 to 5 avoids a simplistic opposition between serious feminism and glamorous femininity. Dorley does not need to become visually austere to be politically credible. Violet does not need to become softer to be likable. Judy does not need to remain vulnerable to be sympathetic. The film allows multiple modes of womanhood to coexist. Their friendship is thus built across difference rather than sameness. They do not become interchangeable. The narrative gains energy from preserving their individual identities while constructing common purpose. This model of solidarity is especially visible in the way Dorley's relationship with the other women changes after the truth about Hart's rumors emerges. Once Violet and Judy understand that Dorley has been isolated through deception, social distance collapses. The problem was never that Dorley failed to belong. The problem was that Hart manipulated perception. The film therefore identifies rumor as a political technology. Gossip is not presented as harmless office entertainment. It can enforce hierarchy by shaping who receives trust, sympathy, and community. Hart's sexual narrative about Dora Lee separates women who might otherwise support one another. Once that isolation ends, his power weakens. This pattern has significance beyond gender. Institutions often maintain hierarchy by encouraging workers to interpret problems individually or competitively. If employees believe one another to be rivals, favorites, incompetents, or threats, they are less likely to compare experiences and recognize structural patterns. Solidarity begins with exchanging information. 9 to 5 makes this exchange enjoyable. The women's conversations are not solemn consciousness-raising sessions, even though they function similarly. They drink, joke, fantasize, and exaggerate. Political awareness grows through pleasure. This emphasis on pleasure helps explain the film's enormous popular impact. Audiences were not merely told that workplaces could be sexist. They were invited to enjoy watching sexist authority become ridiculous. Ridicule can be a potent political emotion because it attacks the aura that power depends upon. Hart wants to appear formidable. The film makes him small. His repeated humiliations dismantle managerial mystique. Once he is restrained, panicked, deceived, and outmaneuvered, the same man who dominated the office becomes comic material. The transformation reminds us that authority often depends on context. Remove the symbols and institutional backing, and the supposedly powerful individual may possess very little independent power. This is why the scenes in Hart's house are so effective. Domestic space reverses the office hierarchy. The man who controlled women at work becomes controlled within a home. Traditional gendered spatial associations are inverted. Historically, domestic space was often imagined as feminine, and the workplace as masculine. 9 to 5 scrambles those categories. Judy is forced from domestic dependence into employment. Dorley and Violet confront workplace patriarchy. Hart is imprisoned at home, while women take command of the office. The spatial reversal is comic, but conceptually elegant. Power migrates with the characters. The house becomes a prison. The office becomes a site of experimentation. The film also uses captivity to explore the difference between physical and institutional coercion. Hart complains loudly when physically restrained, yet he has spent the film restraining other people through employment. The comparison is intentionally exaggerated, but the satire depends on recognizing that economic control can shape behavior as effectively as visible force. Employees cannot simply speak freely because wages matter. Violet cannot casually leave because experience, seniority, and economic responsibilities matter. Dorley cannot respond to harassment without calculating professional consequences. Judy cannot reject the workplace altogether because she needs income. Hart's captivity makes coercion obvious. Their employment makes coercion ordinary. The movie's humor often works by taking invisible structures and making them visible. Stolen credit becomes literal theft. Workplace imprisonment becomes literal imprisonment. Fantasized revenge becomes near criminal reality. Administrative reform becomes the climactic payoff. The title itself performs a similar compression. 9 to 5 sounds neutral, almost mechanical, simply a time span. Yet the phrase came to symbolize an entire organization of life around standardized employment. It divides the day into sellable and supposedly private hours. The song's famous complaint that work can consume one's life resonates because time is the fundamental commodity exchanged in wage labor. The women are not merely selling tasks. They are surrendering predictable portions of their days to an institution whose rules extend beyond those hours through stress, childcare difficulty, and economic dependence. The reforms therefore matter because many of them concern time. Flexibility redistributes temporal control. Job sharing changes the relationship between position and presence. Childcare reduces conflict between paid and unpaid labor. From a feminist perspective, this is essential because the standardized full-time worker was historically imagined as someone whose domestic responsibilities were handled by someone else. When women entered paid employment in greater numbers without an equivalent redistribution of care work, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. 9 to 5 does not offer a full analysis of unpaid domestic labor, but it recognizes that workplace policy cannot be separated from life outside work. Childcare is not a private inconvenience to be solved by individual women. It becomes an organizational issue. That conceptual move remains radical in cultures where employers often treat workers as though family obligations were personal failures intruding upon professional life. The film proposes instead that institutions can adapt to human beings. The distinction sounds obvious, but bureaucracies frequently demand the reverse. People must adapt their bodies, schedules, emotions, and relationships to systems designed for administrative convenience. Hart embodies this philosophy because his management is fundamentally narcissistic. The workplace exists to reflect his authority. Employees become supporting characters in his self-image. Violet's reforms reverse the direction of design. The organization begins responding to workers. The visual transformation of the office reinforces this shift. Plants, color, social spaces, and childcare alter the atmosphere from sterile efficiency to inhabited environment. The office starts to look as though the people inside it have lives. One could criticize the sequence for presenting relatively modest reforms as revolutionary. Flexible schedules and childcare do not abolish exploitation. Yet the modesty is also part of the film's intelligence. It demonstrates how low the baseline has been. Treating workers as humans feels revolutionary because dehumanization has been normalized. The sequence functions as a catalog of obvious ideas made extraordinary by institutional resistance. That remains painfully familiar. In many organizations, reforms are rejected not because they are impractical, but because they threaten symbolic authority. A manager may oppose flexibility because physical presence reassures him that control is visible. Hart's worldview depends on being able to observe and command. Violet's system requires trust. Trust is perhaps the hidden value underneath the film's workplace reforms. Employees are assumed capable of managing responsibilities, rather than inherently inclined toward abuse. This transforms the emotional climate of work. The women themselves also learn trust. Their conspiracy would be impossible without it. Each becomes vulnerable to the others by sharing anger, fear, and incriminating information. Their friendship creates a network of mutual dependence that competes with formal hierarchy. The film suggests that institutions can be reorganized when horizontal relationships become stronger than vertical intimidation. This principle also appears in the comedic staging. Many scenes place the three women together in frames, allowing their reactions to form a collective unit. Hart, by contrast, is often isolated within spaces of authority. He possesses positional power, but lacks genuine community. His relationships are instrumental. He manipulates employees, deceives his wife, harasses Dora Lee, and flatters superiors. The women's relationships become increasingly reciprocal. The opposition is therefore not merely male authority versus female authority. It is domination versus cooperation. This prevents the film from becoming a simple fantasy of replacing one tyrant with another. Violet can be impatient and forceful, but the reforms emerge from conversation and shared experience rather than personal vanity. The film's political imagination remains managerial, but its emotional imagination is collective. That collectivity was central to the movie's cultural significance. The late 1970s and early 1980s were marked by intense debates over the gains and limits of second-wave feminism. Questions of employment, equal pay, reproductive rights, childcare, sexual harassment, and women's representation in public life had become major political issues. At the same time, a conservative reaction was gaining strength in American politics. 9 to 5 arrived almost exactly at the hinge between the social movements of the 1970s and the Reagan era. Its tone therefore matters historically. This is not a pessimistic film about backlash. It is exuberantly optimistic about the possibility of women recognizing shared grievances and changing institutions. That optimism would later acquire a slightly bittersweet quality. Many of the problems the film mocks remained stubbornly persistent. Progress occurred, but the workplace did not simply evolve beyond sexism. The film's endurance partly comes from this incomplete victory. A satire becomes dated when the target disappears. 9 to 5 has remained relevant because too many of its jokes still require no explanation. Contemporary viewers may respond differently to individual details, but the central dynamics remain legible. Women are still interrupted, underestimated, harassed, denied credit, penalized for caregiving, and judged through gendered expectations. At the same time, the workforce has changed in ways the film could not fully anticipate. Digital communication has transformed office geography. Remote work has complicated the meaning of the 9 to 5 schedule. Corporate diversity initiatives have changed the language through which institutions discuss inequality. Yet, digital systems have not eliminated hierarchy. In some cases, they have intensified surveillance by allowing work to follow employees beyond the office. Seen from the era of laptops, messaging platforms, productivity dashboards, video meetings, and algorithmic monitoring, 9 to 5 can appear almost quaint in its physicality. Hart needs walls, doors, desks, and visible presence to exercise control. Modern management can travel through software. But the film's basic question remains: who controls the conditions under which work occurs? This question is larger than its specific historical moment. It is why the movie can be read not only as feminist comedy, but as labor satire. The women's conflict with Hart is fundamentally a conflict over the definition of work. Hart treats work as something managers own and employees perform. Violet treats it as something workers understand collectively. The film sides with experiential knowledge. This becomes evident in scenes where Violet solves problems almost automatically. Her competence has become embodied. She knows not only official procedures, but informal systems. Who to ask, what to fix, how to anticipate. Organizations often depend heavily on such tacit knowledge, while rewarding formal status instead. 9 to 5 understands the gap. The movie's humor derives partly from finally aligning authority with tacit competence. Once Violet can make decisions, the office changes rapidly because she does not need to discover what workers need. She has been listening for years. This creates a satisfying fantasy of immediate reform, although real organizations are rarely so responsive. Structural change usually encounters budgets, regulations, ownership interests, and conflicting priorities. The film simplifies these obstacles because comedy requires momentum, but simplification does not erase insight. The childcare center, for example, appears quickly and works beautifully because the film wants to visualize what institutional recognition looks like. The emotional point is not administrative realism. It is the shock of seeing a workplace designed around actual lives. Similarly, flexible scheduling is presented as obviously sensible because the movie contrasts it with Hart's rigid obsession with control. The reforms collectively form a counter-image of management. Instead of asking how to extract maximum compliance, Violet asks how to make work compatible with dignity. This is also why the film's happy ending avoids romantic closure for the three protagonists. Their fulfillment is primarily social and professional, not marital. Dolly does have a supportive marriage, which serves as an important contrast with Hart's fantasy of her availability. Her husband's presence confirms that Hart's sexual narrative is not only predatory, but delusional. Violet's identity is defined more by competence and family responsibility than romance. Judy's arc explicitly involves rejecting a husband who previously determined her economic fate. The narrative therefore refuses the convention that women's stories must culminate in romantic acquisition. Their central relationship is with one another and with the transformed workplace. This is an important feature of the film's feminist storytelling. Friendship is not a temporary alliance on the way to heterosexual resolution. It is the mechanism of liberation. Their bond also changes the emotional meaning of work. At the beginning, consolidated is isolating. By the end, it has become a community, partly because the women have created relationships strong enough to contest managerial power. Workplace friendship can itself be politically significant because it creates channels of information outside official hierarchy. Employees compare treatment, share knowledge, and support resistance. Hart understands this implicitly, which is why his manipulation of Dolly's reputation is so effective. Isolation protects authority. The film dramatizes the opposite. Community generates agency. This movement from isolation to agency is mirrored by the narrative structure. The early scenes alternate among individual problems. Later scenes increasingly place the women inside shared predicaments. By the kidnapping section, their fates are inseparable. No one can escape without the others. The screenplay thus uses escalating comic stakes to formalize solidarity. Friendship becomes plot. This is one reason the movie feels so satisfying despite its improbability. The outrageous events externalize an emotional process that is entirely plausible. 3 workers discover that their problems are connected. They begin trusting one another. Shared knowledge changes what they believe possible. Everything else is farce. The fantasy sequences can therefore be understood not as digressions, but as the film's ideological hinge. Before the fantasies, anger remains private. During them, anger becomes representable. After them, action becomes possible. The women initially laugh at the idea of revenge. Laughter allows them to say what respectable workplace culture forbids. This is one of comedy's oldest political functions. Jokes create temporary spaces where prohibited thoughts can be spoken without immediate punishment. 9 to 5 uses that permission brilliantly. What if we killed the boss? Becomes a comic question, but underneath it lies another. What if his authority were not inevitable? The second question matters far more. Once Hart is absent, the film answers it. The office continues. That answer punctures one of hierarchy's most persistent myths, that leadership is equivalent to indispensability. Hart needs employees far more than they need Hart. The movie never states this as doctrine. It demonstrates it through plot. This is a stronger rhetorical strategy because spectators experience the argument as comic discovery. We enjoy watching the office improve before necessarily articulating why the improvement is politically meaningful. Popular cinema is especially effective when it makes ideas feel before it names them. 9 to 5 excels at this. Its intellectual content is encoded in satisfaction. We are pleased when Doralee confronts Hart because humiliation has become unbearable. We are pleased when Violet takes charge because wasted competence has become intolerable. We are pleased when Judy gains confidence because dependence has become painful. The emotional logic produces political alignment. This does not mean every viewer leaves with identical conclusions. Some may see the film primarily as a workplace comedy. Others may focus on feminist revenge. Others may remember the song, the stars, or the kidnapping. The film's richness comes from allowing these layers to coexist. Its accessibility is not a dilution of meaning. It is part of the meaning. The choice of comedy was itself strategic because anger about workplace sexism could easily have been dismissed as shrill, bitter, or ideological within the gendered rhetoric of the period. By making the critique irresistibly funny, the film deprives hostile viewers of an easy defense. One can disagree with a lecture. It is harder to preserve Hart's dignity after watching him become ridiculous. Ridicule performs a kind of demystification. The movie also understands that institutions often appear more permanent than they are, because everyday repetition creates an illusion of necessity. The Office works one way because it worked that way yesterday. Comedy interrupts repetition. A kidnapped boss is obviously an extreme interruption, but the resulting freedom allows characters to discover how much of organizational life consists of arbitrary custom. Why must schedules be rigid? Why must childcare remain private? Why must the office be dreary? Why must promotion follow masculine networks? Because Hart says so? Once Hart is gone, many answers disappear. This is political comedy in its purest form. Make the normal strange, and the strange becomes changeable. The film's production design assists by establishing the office as an environment of standardized order before permitting transformation. Rows of desks and repetitive visual patterns communicate interchangeability. Workers can look like components in a machine. The title sequence reinforces this machine-like quality through rhythmic repetition. Yet, the movie never allows the employees themselves to become faceless. Background characters react, gossip, laugh, suffer, and eventually benefit. The Office is both machine and community. The women's reforms shift emphasis from the first toward the second. Color and social activity begin reclaiming space from abstraction. This visual transition is subtle compared with the spectacular fantasy sequences, but ideologically it is more important. Fantasy changes the world in imagination. Management changes the world materially. The movie's final triumph belongs to the material changes. Dolly Parton's song similarly bridges fantasy and materiality because its upbeat rhythm makes labor feel energetic, while the lyrics insist on exploitation. The listener can dance to dissatisfaction. That contradiction is perfectly suited to a film whose method is to make anger pleasurable. Parton's contribution cannot be overstated. Without her, the film might have felt more metropolitan and more explicitly tied to one cultural register. Her presence expands its social texture. Doralee brings a southern voice, country star charisma, and a form of femininity often patronized by urban sophistication. The film refuses that patronization. Doralee is perhaps the character most frequently underestimated by people within the story, and potentially by spectators. The screenplay turns underestimation into a trap. She is emotionally perceptive, loyal, practical, and capable of startling directness. Parton's star persona makes those qualities feel continuous with, rather than opposed to, glamour. This has lasting cultural significance because feminist representation has sometimes struggled with women who enthusiastically inhabit traditional markers of femininity. 9 to 5 does not require Doralee to renounce them. She can wear what she likes and still demand respect. The simplicity of that principle should not obscure its importance. Hart believes her appearance constitutes an invitation. Co-workers interpret it as evidence. The film insists that neither conclusion follows. Appearance does not abolish agency. Parton's performance turns that principle into personality rather than statement. Tomlin's Violet provides an equally important alternative model. She is less interested in charm and more willing to express irritation. Her refusal to perform constant pleasantness challenges another workplace expectation placed disproportionately on women: emotional accommodation. Violet is expected not only to work, but to make others comfortable. Tomlin lets us see the cost. Her face often registers the exhaustion of having understood a problem before everyone else. This becomes one of the film's recurring comic pleasures. Violet's impatience is funny because competence has been forced to coexist with incompetence for too long. Yet she is not simply cynical. Once she gains power, she imagines improvements. Cynicism would mean believing nothing can change. Violet's anger exists because she knows things could be better. That distinction gives the character moral energy. Judy begins from the opposite emotional position. She has not yet accumulated enough experience to be cynical. Her first reaction to difficulty is self-doubt, rather than systemic criticism. This allows the film to dramatize politicization as a learning process. She gradually discovers that competence is teachable, hierarchy is questionable, and authority can be resisted. Her education is both professional and ideological. By the end, she no longer interprets every institutional demand as legitimate simply because it comes from above. That is a major transformation. In this sense, 9 to 5 is almost a coming-of-age story for an adult woman. Judy enters a world whose codes she does not understand. She acquires skills, allies, and a new identity. The difference is that adulthood is not portrayed as stable. Divorce has forced her into a second beginning. The film recognizes that women can undergo radical identity transformations long after conventional narratives would have declared their development complete. This is especially meaningful in relation to the era's changing gender roles. Women who had organized their lives around marriage could suddenly find themselves economically vulnerable after divorce. Entering the workforce could mean confronting both practical inexperience and a culture that treated such inexperience as personal failure. Judy's humiliation therefore has a social dimension. She represents people who must learn publicly what institutions assume everyone already knows. Violet's mentorship, however impatient at first, becomes essential. Female knowledge passes horizontally. This is another alternative to Hart's hierarchy. Instead of hoarding expertise, the women share it. Knowledge becomes a resource for collective survival. The film repeatedly contrasts this with Hart's use of information as leverage. He manipulates secrets, rumors, and access. They exchange experience. These are different information cultures. One protects authority, the other builds solidarity. The kidnapping plot eventually forces the women to become strategists. They must coordinate schedules, conceal Hart, investigate documents, and manage the office simultaneously. The absurdity of this workload is itself funny. Their criminal enterprise resembles another layer of unpaid administrative labor. Even rebellion becomes organizational work. Violet naturally emerges as planner because she has spent years managing complexity without formal recognition. The conspiracy simply reveals skills the company had already exploited. This is one of the script's most elegant ironies. The women do not suddenly become capable after Hart disappears. They were capable all along. What changes is permission. The film thereby challenges narratives in which empowerment magically creates talent. Empowerment reveals talent previously constrained. Dorley's confidence, Violet's strategic intelligence, and Judy's adaptability already exist in different forms. Their alliance allows those capacities to operate more freely. Hart's incompetence becomes more visible by comparison. Coleman plays him as a man who mistakes positional authority for personal superiority. The more his position is threatened, the more childish he becomes. This regression is comic because domination often depends on ceremonial seriousness. Strip away ceremony, and the powerful may look embarrassingly ordinary. Hart's panic during captivity exposes the fragile ego beneath managerial swagger. He demands obedience, even when he has no mechanism to enforce it. The women's refusal to respond according to the old script destabilizes him. Power needs recognition. Their laughter withdraws it. This is perhaps why comedy is so dangerous to authoritarian personalities. Fear confirms their importance. Ridicule denies it. Hart can tolerate resentment better than mockery because resentment still acknowledges power. Mockery shrinks him. The film's audience joins the women in this act. Every laugh is a tiny refusal to accept Hart's self-image. The collective experience of theatrical laughter therefore has political resonance. Hundreds of viewers can participate in the dismantling of authority without leaving their seats. The film's enormous commercial success suggests how widely its frustrations resonated. Its popularity cannot be explained solely by star power, though the cast and song were obviously major attractions. Audiences recognized the workplace. They recognized the boss. Perhaps they recognized themselves. This recognizability is one reason the film became more than a period comedy. It entered cultural memory as shorthand for workplace dissatisfaction. The title became almost proverbial. The song became an anthem. The characters became types without losing individuality. Successful popular satire often produces this kind of cultural compression. Complex grievances become attached to memorable images and phrases. 9 to 5 accomplished that without simplifying its central emotional truth. Being treated as less capable, less credible, or less human at work accumulates into anger. The film gives that anger form. Its legacy can be traced through later workplace comedies that similarly imagine incompetent management, confronted by workers who understand the organization better. Films and television series from Office Space to The Office inherit aspects of this tradition, though their gender politics and tonal strategies differ. 9 to 5 remains distinctive because its rebellion is explicitly tied to women's collective experience, and because its utopian impulse is unusually concrete. Many workplace satires conclude with escape. The hero quits. 9 to 5 imagines staying and changing the institution. That difference matters. Escape stories preserve the workplace by treating freedom as individual departure. Reform stories challenge the workplace by asking why everyone should have to endure the same conditions. Violet does not want to abandon the domain in which she has invested her expertise. She wants recognition and authority. Dora Lee does not want to be driven out by Hart's harassment. She wants Hart's behavior to stop. Judy needs employment. The solution cannot simply be withdrawal. Their circumstances therefore demand institutional rather than purely individual answers. The film's optimism lies in believing that such answers are possible. Whether that optimism feels inspiring or naive depends partly on the viewer's experience of organizations. Real institutions are often more resistant than consolidated. Bad managers do not always disappear. Progressive reforms do not always increase measurable productivity. Senior executives do not always reward humane innovation. Yet comedy is allowed to construct experimental worlds. The question is what those worlds make imaginable. 9 to 5 imagines that a workplace can become more effective when it becomes more humane. That proposition should be uncontroversial. The persistence of resistance to it keeps the film relevant. The movie also recognizes that reforms benefit more than the protagonists. Once Violet, Dora Lee, and Judy gain temporary authority, they do not merely improve their own salaries or offices. They alter conditions for coworkers. This distinguishes collective empowerment from individual advancement. A story in which Violet simply receives Hart's job might satisfy meritocratic justice. A story in which she uses power to change policy carries broader political significance. The film chooses the latter. Even its fantasy of promotion is therefore socialized. Violet's leadership has consequences beyond herself. This is especially meaningful given the history of women entering management within institutions still organized around masculine norms. One possible path to equality is assimilation. Women gain access to power by adopting existing managerial behavior. 9 to 5 imagines transformation instead. Violet does not become Hart. The office under her influence looks different. This distinction represents one of the strongest elements of the film's feminist politics. Equality is not simply the right to dominate equally, it is the opportunity to redefine the exercise of authority. Of course, the film does not fully theorize this point. It remains a comedy, not a political treatise. But cinema often thinks through images and consequences rather than propositions. We see the office change. We see workers respond. We see productivity improve. The sequence constitutes an argument. The childcare center may be the most symbolically dense reform because it makes visible people ordinarily excluded from the workplace's conception of the worker. Children appear inside corporate space. Their presence disrupts the fantasy that employees arrive without relationships. The workplace acknowledges dependency instead of pretending independence. This matters because modern economies rely on care labor while often treating care as external to economic life. 9 to 5 does not solve that contradiction, but it makes it visible. By integrating childcare into employment, the film suggests that organizations participate in the social reproduction of labor, whether they acknowledge it or not. Workers need care networks in order to work. This is elementary and radical at once. Flexible scheduling similarly questions the sanctity of synchronized time. Why must everyone work identical hours if tasks can be accomplished otherwise? Rigid schedules often function as symbols of control, even when they are not operationally necessary.